Hi everyone, another week down and a bunch of stuff as always going on. I am attired like so, for those of you watching the video, as I've been out having a hit of tennis this morning with my son, and I'm making the most of being able to beat him while I can, which is actually both good fun and kind of scary to think I may not be able to do it for a whole lot longer. But regardless, there has been a bunch of stuff happening this week, as there always is. And the first one I thought I'd touch on relates to a problem that I was having here. It is the most first world of first world problems, which relates to the connectivity of the Wi-Fi whilst on my jet ski. Now, this is not genuinely a problem. This is not like a big Australian thing that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And in fact, as I wrote, this was more to do with the fact that I got sent some bits which I didn't need, but I wanted to find a good use case for. Now, I've written about Ubiquiti before, and Ubiquiti is this manufacturer of good Wi-Fi things. Written about how they solved a bunch of my network problems, and I've talked about them on this weekly update before as well. And I think I've said this before, I've certainly said it in writing. When I wanted to go and redo my network at home, I went and bought everything mainstream off the high street, also known as eBay. Went and bought all the bits, spent a couple of grand doing the whole thing properly. And I was enormously happy with the result. Wrote about it, and there's been so many people, even today, and it's probably about 4 or 5 months on now, that ping me. This happens every single week, multiple times, and they go, hey, I've gone and done the Ubiquiti thing, like what you've done, and it's awesome and I'm really happy about it. So Ubiquiti got really, really good press out of this. And to show their thanks, they sent me a box of Ubiquiti things, which was really, really nice of them. Now, this was the first time they'd ever given me anything too. So just to be very clear, this was not sort of an incentivized blog post when I originally wrote about it and did it all. So they sent me a bunch of stuff, and to be honest, I have got so much Wi-Fi in my house already. This was really unnecessary. But within the box of things they sent me a UAP ACM and a UAP ACM Pro. Now, I'll link to the blog post and I'll explain what they are, but basically they're part of this Unify mesh implementation. And the mesh implementation basically says, look, let's get a whole bunch of access points. They can all talk to each other. They can all create a great big range of network. And then we can cover like a city block, or a shopping center or whatever it may be in mesh. And I looked at my home and went, well, what am I going to do with them? Like, how am I actually going to use this stuff? And I thought, well, look, what'll be fun is I will take the Pro, and you'll see in the blog post if you haven't seen already, it's like a big device that sits flat on a wall. It's very sleek. It's kind of all white and it integrates into the environment. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to put it over my barbecue because I didn't have a strong signal out there just by virtue of where the Ethernet jacks were for the other access points. And the other thing is, if I put it on the barbecue, then that can line of sight down to the jetty where I park the jet ski, and then I can put the little one on there, and it can do its mesh thing with the big one and basically expand the network. I mentioned first world problems, didn't I? So this, again, is entirely unnecessary, but if you had these bits sitting there, you'd want to do something with them as well, right? So anyway, I did that, and it was kind of cool because now that just becomes part of my whole Ubiquiti network. So I go into my administration, which I've written about before, and I see that there's these 2 new devices. I adopt them, and it is literally like magic happens and everything just works. So that was it. It just took a few minutes to set them up. Took me much longer to figure out how to mount them somewhere securely and actually run the power for them. They're all power over Ethernet. I've got PoE injectors, so it's basically mains port into the injector and then a Cat6 cable out into the actual device itself. But what it means is that you can extend your range massively with these devices. And this is not like they're just talking normal 802.11 networky Wi-Fi stuff between them. They actually have a much greater transmit power between them. They extend your range way, way further than if you were just like putting in another normal access point. I didn't realize until yesterday how far they extended my range because I went out on the jet ski out into places where there's definitely no range, kilometers away. And then as I'm coming home, I stopped and I've pulled out my phone and it's like, oh, I'm connected to a network. First of all, I hope it's my network. Second of all, yes, it was. And I was like 9 residential blocks away. And I tweeted yesterday, and I'm looking at what I shared, where it's like, here's the jet ski on the water, and then the house is like way down there, and the access point is there on the wall somewhere, which was kind of crazy range. And it's just funny now to look, and I'll put the tweet in the notes. It's funny to look at the chronology of the activity of the network, where you see devices roaming between access points. And it's like, here's where the mobile phone, so my iPhone, goes from the barbecue to the jetty. It disappears for a while, comes back, rejoins the jetty and the barbecue. It's ridiculous. But think about the practical use cases in environments where you do actually need range, and you do need a lot of coverage, and you do have distances. And I mentioned in the blog post, my parents have a shed that's probably 40 meters from the house. Now, if you wanted to have Wi-Fi and coverage in a place like that, this would be a really good example of where that might actually make sense and be properly useful. So that was Ubiquiti. Very, very happy with what's going on there. I'm doing something else with their gear that is not related to my house, which really doesn't need any more Wi-Fi. But it's something else which is really, really super cool. And this is exactly what I would do if I was going to build a house or install stuff and actually have the ability to, let's just say, put things in right. So I'll talk more about that when it's done. That's going to be cool. All right, on to other stuff. Now this week, the CIA lost some toys. A lot of toys, a lot of these sort of offensive style toys to track people. And it was a really big story in the news, and I spent a significant portion of this week talking to media and doing video things and radio things and answering questions, which often tends to happen with the mainstream consumer press after these stories. And a lot of the stories were sort of like, oh, look, we just realized the CIA is spying with you or spying on you via your TVs, listening to your voice conversations, using the microphone in your TV. And I think, to be honest, one of the biggest things about this story was that the masses, the general population, are suddenly realizing that these devices can do these things. So for most of us, and probably for you as well, if you're interested in the things I do, this is not going to come as a surprise that there is vulnerability in software that can be used to do these things. And whether it's cyber criminals or nation states exploiting them, no surprises there. So, for many of us, this was like, business as usual. Lots of interesting angles, this CIA thing. One of the interesting angles is that we're sort of saying, okay, well, look, there's been stuff like the Snowden leaks, everything the NSA's been doing. And this gets likened to that. It's a very, very different premise. And the thing that's really different about it is that what we learned about the NSA was that they were doing mass data collection of every piece of information they could get their hands on. So my information, your information, doesn't matter if they think you're a terrorist or any sort of other nasty person. It's just like, give us the data, we might be able to use it later on. What we've seen from the CIA, when we're talking about ODE vulnerabilities that are specific to, say, iOS or Samsung TVs, this is much more targeted profiling of people. So they're going to say, let's say for your Samsung TV, this particular person is a high value target. We're going to push this vulnerability, or we're going to push this exploit down to their TV so we can listen to them when the TV appears to be off. This is not something they push out to every single device. And part of the reason for that is that this is the sort of thing that can be detected if you get people looking in the right places. Now, they're going to want to manage that very, very carefully. And here's sort of the bit where I'm, for the most part, supportive of this sort of approach. We do want intelligence agencies to be able to monitor bad people. Then this is the sort of uncomfortable truth, right? So scroll back a few years, pre-internet, we want them to be able to go and put bugs in the homes of people who might be planning evil things. We want that to happen. And most reasonable citizens would say, yes, that is a good idea, so long as they're putting them in the right places. And as we fast forward now to the internet era, and we've got these vulnerabilities in things, and you can remotely exfiltrate voices, etc., I'm quite okay with them bugging Samsung TVs of people that are high value targets because they've got to really want to get their data. It's got to be a really good reason. So I'm happy in the same way that if the FBI really wants to get into an iPhone and they have to spend $1 million to do it, and inevitably it'd be cheaper to get into a Samsung TV, I'm cool with that. The uncomfortable bit here is this discussion around, well, shouldn't they really tell Apple, Samsung, Microsoft, etc., that there's a vulnerability in their software? Because if they don't tell them and it doesn't get patched, who else is exploiting it? And that's a very valid argument to make too. So I can see both sides of this discussion here. Now, interestingly, after this has become public, and it's really only all blown up in the last few days, we're now already seeing responses from technology companies. Just in the last couple of hours, I've seen Notepad++ push out an update because one of the DLLs they're dependent on was obviously identified within this document, or within this trove of documents that WikiLeaks has pushed out, as being a mechanism by which data could be exfiltrated from your Notepad. Now, they've just basically said, well, look, we're actually going to check it signed, and it actually checks out okay, which seems like a pretty reasonable response. It's not a malicious DLL that's in there. But it's just interesting to now see responses already from a tech company going, well, we're going to make our product better because of this. I'm very happy seeing that. You will obviously see arguments from the other side, which is you'll get official people in the US stand up and say, well, this has now jeopardized our ability to stop bad people from doing bad things. I think you can argue it both ways a lot of the time, so I don't really want to get into the debate about was this a good thing or a bad thing. It has certainly been overhyped, and we will certainly see some patches and things come as a result, and they will move on and find other vulnerabilities and other things, and the whole thing will replay itself over time. So that was CIA. Now, moving on to something completely different. Have I been pwned and the 1.4 billion record data leak that Chris Vickery reported on earlier in the week. So this was interesting. We sort of started getting some hints from Chris and also Steve Reagan from CSO Online magazine about a trove of data. And that sort of figure was mentioned, the 1.4 billion figure. And they came out with their stories earlier this week, and what it boiled down to is an entity called River City Media and some affiliates, it looks like possibly affiliates that were sort of attempting to do things under the same control, but possibly segment themselves a little bit corporation-wise. Anyway, these guys had a lot of data. I assume they still have it, it's just that we have it too. Anyway, so they had all this data, and this was going into spam lists. And it would include things like not just email addresses, names, IP addresses, in some cases physical addresses, which would allow them to target people. Now, the data aside, Chris actually did a really interesting write-up where he's spoken about things like the way they would try and almost do like slow loris attacks against Gmail servers to bombard them with long-running connections and then try and push through as many emails as they possibly could. So some pretty nasty, shady stuff on behalf of spammers. Worth a read of Chris's blog post in there. I'm going to put a link to it in my blog post for this video. But be that as it may, there's now this 1.4 billion records. Now, Chris and I had a bit of a chat about it, and I said, look, I am happy to put that in Have I Been Pwned as a way of people discovering if they're on this list, because when you hear 1.4 billion, that is a really large chunk of the internet. Now, he was happy to help. He gave me a list of email addresses only that I could load in. And he gave me, it is like 1.39 something billion records. And I went, okay, well, this is going to be interesting. Like how am I going to get this into Have I Been Pwned? Because the largest data breach I dealt with before then was MySpace, which was 360 million odd records. Now, also, I'm saying data breach and spam list here a bit interchangeably. A few months ago, I introduced the concept into Have I Been Pwned of spam lists for many good reasons, not least of which was that most people said, look, if they're on a spam list, they want to know about it. Can't really do anything about it, but they'd like to know about it. So there was that. And then there's the fact that even though this was a spam list, it did get leaked by unsecured servers and things like that. So in a way, it's kind of like a breach of the spammers. But be that as it may, I've got the data. This posed multiple challenges to get it into Have I Been Pwned. And I was going to write a blog post about this. I started putting notes in a blog post. And I'm probably not going to now, and I'll explain why as we go along. I'm going to use this medium instead to tell you the things that I think were notable about it. So the first thing is, what I do when I get one of these breaches or collections of addresses is I go through and I run a little batch process that I've written which just extracts all the unique emails. Now, normally this runs very quickly because normally I'm passing 1 million, 5 million, 10 million email addresses into it, takes a minute or two, and it comes out and it goes, okay, here are all the unique email addresses. And there's a bit of cleanup in here, right? So it'll do things like it will lowercase them all. It'll make sure that they're unique based on being lowercased. So if you have the same thing with two different cases, it's really one email address. Trims out white spaces, removes email addresses that are definitely not addresses, or strings that are definitely not addresses. Normally not a problem. When you pass in nearly 1.4 billion, stuff starts to go wrong. So I was running it on my P50, so this guy over here, which I normally do all my processing on because it's got a Xeon processor and 64 gigabytes of RAM. It ran out of memory, wasn't going to work. And then I was starting to have all these sort of mental debates about, well, how do I solve this with cloud? Like, can I just throw more cloud at it and fix it? And I'm going, wow, you can actually get some really big VMs in the cloud, like hundreds of gigabytes of VM memory instances. What I ended up actually doing is I sucked it all into SQL Server on that machine, on that P50. Sucked it all into SQL Server, and then I've got a script that I use there to effectively do the same thing. So to normalize all those email addresses, lowercase them, trim them, distinct them, all that sort of thing. And that actually worked fine. So that got the data out. It was doing what SQL Server likes to do and using every spare byte of that 64 gigabytes of memory on the machine. Eventually distilled it down to only, and if you're listening on podcasts, I'm air quoting this, only, 393 million records. Now, a couple of ways of looking at this. One is that is a small subset of almost 1.4 billion. So it's a much, much smaller number than what was doing the rounds. And when we look at news headlines which said things like 1.4 billion people impacted or 1.4 billion email addresses, not quite right. It was much less than that. And this is largely why I didn't end up writing the story, because the story I was writing was how do I deal with something that's like a billion? I thought it would maybe be a billion. How do I deal with a billion email addresses? Because that would be 3 times larger than the MySpace data, which was the previous high. Once it got down to 393 million, it was actually pretty close to MySpace, and I was effectively doing something that was pretty close to what I had already done. Now, I still had challenges, so that's why I'm going to talk about them here. So I distilled that down, 393 million. What I do in terms of my process then is I zip all of those files, or rephrase that. I save all those email addresses into a text file and I zip that. So 1 email address per line. Zip that, upload it into Azure, and then the next bit happens. This sounds easy, but uploading 2 gigabytes in Australia is actually not easy. This is a problem I have every time I record this video. It's why I'm doing it now in the morning so that by the night it will actually be uploaded. I didn't want that long lead time, so I'm starting to have this debate again, this mental debate. Well, how do I get the data up quickly? I could have done the processing in Azure, so I could have stood up a SQL server that was large enough and processed it in there, which would have meant having something big, not instances I had already. I would have had to create another instance, a large instance, wait for the data to import into there, pay to actually run it, and then extract it from there and then blow it away. What I end up doing is going, okay, my internet connection at home is 2 megabits, which is kind of crap. However, if I plug this in and I tether as my iPad, then I get about 30 megabits up. And then I pay about $10 a gigabyte when I go over my plan. So this is, like, it's silly money as well, right? Because I got lots of donations after this. But I'm having this discussion in my mind of, do I pay $20 in order to be able to actually upload it 15 times faster? Which is what I ultimately did. So I got it uploaded pretty quick. And we then get on to the next set of challenges. Now, one of the challenges is that I have a database table in SQL, which is a SQL Azure Platform as a Service instance, which has a list of all the breaches. And one of the attributes on every breach is a pwn count, right? It's just a number, how many incidents are in there, or how many records are in the incident. And of course, in this particular incident, there's 393 something odd million. No problems at all. I wanted to test all this in my development environment before making it live. So this is whilst data was churning away in Azure. And when I put this into my development environment, it broke. And the reason it broke is that the data type in the SQL database is an integer. The maximum size for an integer, for a 4-bit, 32-bit, let's try that again. So for a 32-bit integer is just over 2 billion. So it's like I actually wrote it down here, 2,147,000,000, yada, 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 which is fine. And that is much larger than the actual number that I had to put in the column, because I had to put in 393 million. However, on the front page of Have I Been Pwned, there is a number which represents the sum of all of the account sizes across all the breaches. That just exceeded that number. So I just exceeded 2.147 billion. In fact, I was very, very close to it anyway. Now it's up to about 2.5 billion in total, 2.4 something billion. So obviously I got an arithmetic overflow. It was too large for the data type. So now I have to have a big int in the database, and the big int in the database then persists through via entity framework into other data types, which had to go from integers to longs and all this other sort of stuff. Look, a minor thing in the scheme of things. I'm certainly not the first person to have this problem. YouTube had this problem when Psy, the Korean bloke who did the Gangnam Style video, they never expected a video to exceed 2.1 billion views. It did. Other people who are much more well-resourced than me have had these problems beforehand. Fortunately, I managed to have this problem in my development environment before I pushed it out, fixed it, and we're done. But that's just kind of one of the little things that happens when you get scale. And I never expected, when I built this service, and I started with like 155 million, never expected that at some point I would have to exceed 2.1 billion and actually use a different data type. Fortunately, an easy problem to solve. Other problems that came up though, the processing that happens in Azure, part of the processing I do is at one stage I create a zip. And a lot of this is sort of automated and abstracted away. And the library which I'm using to create the zip kept bombing out. And it bombed out because the file got too large. So the fix for this is I had to go and set an attribute around use zip64 when saving, in order to try and actually do this as a 64-bit process, which then gives you obviously a huge amount more scale than as a 32-bit process. Minor thing, fortunately, the way all of these processes run in Azure, everything gets queued. It's highly resilient to when things fail. So update the code, push the code, wait for magic to happen, all good. So there was that. That was interesting. Now, what else happened here? I had a lot of suggestions from people, because I was sort of tweeting this as I went along. So I'd go, okay, here's what I'm up to, here's what I'm doing. A lot of people would suggest things like, I showed, for example, one of the scale of Azure VM I could have used, which I didn't end up using. And they'll go, oh, you should go and do that in, insert my favorite cloud provider here, because it's cheaper. It's like, hang on a second. Think that through, right? Go to a brand new cloud provider in a totally different data center with a totally different environment and do something which is cheaper, but it only needs to run for like an hour or two anyway, and you're paying a few bucks. I think the most I was going to pay was like $9 an hour for like a massive instance. And yes, that's $240 a day and like thousands of dollars a month, but it doesn't matter. You're only going to run it for a few minutes. So yeah, interesting suggestions there. I got suggestions around people saying, for example, my email extraction process I mentioned, which was bombing out with that scale, and I had to actually put it in SQL instead. They're going, oh, you should rewrite all that. And it's like, well, hang on a second. This, by any reasonable definition, is a very, very exceptional circumstance that I can solve by doing something else small and kind of hacky, but basically the problem goes away. And I just think it's interesting where there's almost like this part of us that goes, we should do all these things as right as we possibly can and invest the effort and make it all work. But I've got to get stuff done as well. And this was a really fast way of getting stuff done, making it work, and I will very unlikely have this problem again. And if I do, it'll be exceptional again, because I've got nearly 200 data breaches in there, and this is the first time I've had one of this scale. So I appreciate all the input, all the good ideas. There is normally a lot more to the ecosystem than just that one thing which you see externally. So regardless, that data is now in there. I sent about 156,000, might have been 157,000 notification emails to individuals. And I sent about 9,500 notification emails to domain holders. So all told, I was getting towards the 170,000 emails I had to send yesterday. And a lot of people got quite a surprise. Lots of people said, can you tell me the data? Now, I've spoken about this before. So first of all, no, I'm not going to go into people's records and send them pieces of data from a data breach for all sorts of reasons I've explained before. Secondly, I don't have it because the only thing that Chris gave me was email addresses, and I'm quite fine with that. Don't go and bug Chris about it either, right? So Chris is in the same boat as me in terms of not being sort of the personal butler to go and retrieve your data. I made a suggestion to some people that if you want to know what data River City Media lost about you, maybe get in touch with River City Media and ask them. I would not expect a positive response because, first of all, they're obviously lousy, stinking scammers. So, scammers, spammers, very small difference, quite frankly. So there's that. The other thing is I got in touch, or rather I had a message come to me from River City Media who said, can you please tell everyone to stop calling us up and abusing us, because yes, we are River City Media, but we're based in Portland, Oregon. We're not the River City Media who was doing the spamming. So very unfortunate for those guys to share a name which has been in the press so much. And if you do a Google Trends search for River City Media, you'll see it's like flat for 5 years, and then it's just bang. So obviously people are searching for this company, finding it, and abusing the wrong people. Bottom line is, there's really nothing you can do about this. If you're in one of these spam lists, it's awareness. Your data is out there in one other place you'd probably rather it not be, but you can't put that genie back in the bottle. Last thing, so Checkmarx is still sponsoring me this week. They are the guys who do lots of cool static analysis stuff. They do static analysis that can run in the IDE as well. So you're typing away and it goes, it looks like you're trying to concatenate a SQL string here. Maybe you shouldn't do that. And it runs in your continuous integration environment as well, so you can plug it into your Microsoft CI or your TeamCity or all these sorts of things, which is pretty cool. So they can do lots of cool analysis of your code as you write it and once you've written it before it even runs. So big thanks to those guys. I think I'm filled out sponsorship-wise through until about the middle of April at the moment. So anyone who wants to jump on board after that would be awesome. And that is it for this week. And it did end up being a long one, unexpectedly. But maybe that's just the way these are going now. So thanks for watching, and who knows what will be on the agenda next week.